Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the IDB event, and I'm also welcoming not only our panelists but also very good friends and colleagues from the other MDBs. We're going to share different experiences in Latin America about mainstreaming biodiversity and nature, and how we can implement and be ambitious with the new Global Biodiversity Framework. First of all, I would like to introduce our panel. First, I have Daniela Manusevich, Director of the Natural Resources and Biodiversity Division from the Government of Chile. Welcome, Daniela. Dominic Jeremy, Director General in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office from the UK. Welcome, Dominic. Slav Gatchav, Managing Director of Sustainable Debt at the Nature Conservancy. Welcome. Mariana Sarmiento, Executive Manager of Terrazos, Colombia. Sylvie Lemet, Ambassador of the Environment from France, will be coming soon. And Federico Basañez, the Manager of the Outreach and Partnership Department of the IDB. My name is Juan Pablo Bonilla. I'm the Manager of Sustainable Development and Climate at the IDB. It's a pleasure being with all of us. So let's start with the role of MDBs in supporting the region in this agenda. And I would like to briefly tell you about the IDB and the other MDBs in general. We have a key challenge to mainstream biodiversity and nature into our operations first, but at the same time in supporting our countries in mainstreaming biodiversity and nature into development. So before COP26, we developed a joint MDB group for biodiversity and natural capital. We made a joint statement at COP26 about our commitment as MDBs to do this. And I'm very happy on behalf of the ADB to tell you and report we have developed our action plan on biodiversity that will be approved after the COP to incorporate the different outcomes from the negotiations presented to the board of directors of the ADB. But at the same time, we merge the Natural Capital and Biodiversity Group with the Climate Change Division more than 2 years ago to show the importance of putting together these two important agendas and have a more integrated view of the importance of climate and biodiversity for sectors, but also to work in the territory. And that is what we call the mainstream. So we have started the process of mainstreaming at the ADB. I would like to thank not only the government of the UK, but also the government of France, because their support to develop the Natural Capital Lab and also the Blue Fund at the bank were instrumentals to start piloting this mainstreaming. But at the same time, little by little, we have been incorporating nature and biodiversity dimension into the infrastructure projects of the bank. So far, we have about 30 projects of infrastructure with biodiversity, with nature components for about $900 million that have mobilized about 400 more. And we're starting to do that at the territorial level as well. We have incorporated nature and biodiversity in cities. With the Blue Carbon Fund from UK, we have started working, for example, in Panama, in Barranquilla, Colombia, as part of the Biodiversities Program, in Jamaica, developing a new methodology with the University of West Indies to value mangroves. So I wanted to highlight that beyond the project level, we have to work in the territory, also when we talk about rural development, and when we see sustainable development in territories. And that's an important issue for us in the development of the Amazon Initiative. The IDB launched and announced at the COP26 our initiative to work in territories of the Amazon with 4 pillars: social pillar, sustainable agriculture and rural development, sustainable infrastructure and cities, and bioeconomy. And we're seeing how biodiversity and climate also are part of the development of the Amazon. So to summarize, I would just say that we need a big challenge to mainstream internally in our operations. Second, to start mainstreaming this process with our countries. We have already engaged in 9 country strategies of the bank, bringing biodiversity and nature, and how we support our countries in different levels. The first one, macro level, I would like to highlight what we're doing with Chile. We're supporting the Central Bank of Chile to do national accounting, but at the same time, the Ministry of Environment and Finance to do the new Committee for Natural Capital and mainstream natural capital into development. We're doing the same thing with Costa Rica, supporting blue economy as part of the national plan of Costa Rica. So are just some examples at the macro level that we will know better today that has to be complemented with financing innovation. So we will talk about debt swaps with the example of Barbados that we hope to follow with other countries, but at the same time with financial innovation on different levels to show the importance not only of technology, but also of private sector to be part of this agenda. With this, I know, Sylvie, you have to leave earlier, so I would like to open the floor with you. Welcome to this event, and thank you for all the support that France has provided to the IDB to start this process. Thank you, Sylvie.
Thank you very, very much. I'm really happy to be here and spending this time with you on this very, very important topic. You will find me as an advocate on the role of the MDBs and how they can really make a difference in the years to come. I think the moment we are in is really trying to signal to the world that for the first time, I think, biodiversity now is an important and very serious issue. It has to be funded, but it has also to be mainstreamed in every operation. The way the multilateral development banks have embarked on a journey, I would say, on the climate arena has now to be moved towards biodiversity. It has been done and with great success, and the multilateral development banks are, in a way, providing the bulk of the money on climate. Not all of it by far, but a lot, and that makes a big difference. The money that is needed for biodiversity is not as huge in a way as climate, and that's good news because we're not talking about building, factories or I don't know, whatever, very important, or ending mining and all that. We're talking about preserving a part in a very qualitative way, and we're talking of mainstreaming biodiversity on the rest, I would say, the 70% that we should be managing in a sustainable way. And that is not necessarily entailing huge costs, but it does entail cost. And they have to be, and they will be higher if it is not mainstreamed into our operations. They will be higher tomorrow. So that's the urgency for me, is to stop doing harm. I remember at COP21 and the years before, it was do no harm, do no harm. And so that was slightly and gradually understood. I think the same has to be understood for biodiversity. We are far from there because we don't really know how to assess and measure. So the first step that all the MDBs have taken together to really assess and measure biodiversity is absolutely the first one that is needed. I think everyone is doing that, or at least a lot of actors are starting doing that in the world, in the private sector, and there are quite a lot of methodologies. It's not entirely fully there yet, by the way, so it means that we still have a little bit of a way to go in terms of exactly do we all agree on the same way. That is not an excuse, and that should not be an excuse for not financing biodiversity. So the first thing I would say the MDBs should, and I don't want to be looking like I'm giving advice, but it's my vision that the first thing is indeed how to avoid doing harm in their own operation, but also how to help countries that are assisted identify how to avoid having negative impact. One thing, that we have here is a target 14, is clean. That's very good news. And that target is basically saying that all governments should really review their expenditures to assess what it be their impact on biodiversity. I'm not sure we are many to do that, to be very honest. In France, we have started to do that about 2-3 years ago, and the methodology is still improving. So that needs to be done at a large scale. If all these the countries of the world would have at least a simple methodology to make sure that they assess how their own budget is impacting biodiversity in 4 years' time, that would be a big gain. And this is where MDBs, as supporters of uh, usually the finance ministers, you have an enormous responsibility, which is positive, an enormous responsibility, which may be negative if it is not done. So I would say, please go ahead. And this is the first thing perhaps you should be doing. The second thing is that MDBs should also help countries, in my view, to implement what they will be their contribution to the GBF. All countries are asked to do a national plan on biodiversity. I think MDBs are there to either help doing this plan and making sure that this is not a plan that is done in one part, like sustainable development was used to be treated in private companies. You have a nice sustainable development director who is somewhere on the shelf, and then let's continue business as usual. Well, now is no more on the shelf, and it's a conversation that is happening in board and at board level. I think the same needs to happen in each country, and you could help make sure that finance ministers get on board. We have no finance ministers here. I think this is very unfortunate. I think it can make a big difference. So that would be my second, should I say plea, or should I say advice, or whatever. But if you can help raise also the understanding of finance ministers, this is totally something that MDBs are made for and fit for. Um, the other thing is, of course, to help also government mainstream biodiversity in all their strategies when they are indeed looking at agriculture, fisheries, and others. How is that coherent with what has been approved? And I know that as MDBs, we have, and we're all responsible for that. There is a board there that is not necessarily the same people that have adopted the GBF. I think that has to, in a way, change in the way that we cannot afford to have a schizophrenic approach to that. We absolutely need to make sure that this is indeed part of the way that you are going to work. And I would say the last thing perhaps that you are very good at doing is also bring in the private sector and make sure you have joint, endeavor, joint funds, and everything that can help. A lot of private sector investors are really starting to be serious about that. And this is where you have a leverage effect in terms of MDBs that I think would be very useful. I don't know if this is what you expected. Perhaps you expected me to talk more about France, but I just think you are a leader, IDB, in terms of moving towards those activities. That's why we are supporting you as France in several instances and several funds. So I'm just saying we are looking to you with the hope that indeed we will have, and make sure that also the negotiators are aware of the fact that you are there and you have an important role. It's impressive that there is perhaps sometimes still a need to repeat it. And I think you have a great job to do. I hope let's do it in the next 8 years to implement the GBF. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvie, and thanks a lot for your suggestions and support. And you are totally right. I think the challenge of taxonomies. Yesterday, we had a very good meeting with all my MDB's colleagues, and one of the most important things that we're gonna do in 2023 is consolidate the working group for biodiversity and natural capital among the MDBs and develop the nature positive methodology so we can, as we had developed in the past for climate, also have a common methodology to measure, as well as we are developing joint the approach for Paris alignment. That's one thing. The other one is how we can support our countries to do that. And that's why, as you mentioned, doing the taxonomies and valuation of biodiversity will be very important. With the Natural Capital Project of Stanford and the GF, we're going to start working with 5 countries in the region to do that, to incorporate nature into their planning. Chile is one of them, so I think it's a very good introduction to pass the word to Daniela. And yesterday we had a very good meeting with the team from finance of Chile that was here, And something that I would like to really highlight is the work that Chile is doing together, the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Environment. We're supporting the central bank for national accounting, but also the Ministry of Finance and Environment to many things that Daniela will share with us. So welcome, Daniela.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I want to say hi to everyone. My name is Daniela Manusevic. I am here representing my minister, Maisa Rojas, who is not able to be here because of other duties. I'm head of the Natural Resource and Biodiversity Division at the Ministry of the Environment. So first, I would like to mention, well, as we all know, probably in this room, biodiversity is going through a crisis. We have learned this crisis is mostly centered in first, what we have learned is losing species, but also we are losing processes. And processes is what keep us alive. In that sense, it's important to focus on developing a framework that can, on one hand, take into consideration the stocks, what we have, and but also how is working, whether it's working fine or whether the working of the ecosystems are being depleted in some way. So in that sense, it makes a lot of sense. I would say I would take as a principle, avoid harm. We know little about biodiversity in general. We know little about processes. So the first things that we should try is to avoid harm. And for that, I would say that mainstreaming is key. And well, Chile economic development highly depends on the use and of natural resources and of the processes. Therefore, protecting first understanding our natural capital and second protecting it's key. So you can protect what you don't know, and that is the first thing. And we need to create this framework that is on one hand thought in process, but also in processes, considering that some capital it's critical. We need to protect it. We need to protect it clearly. Well, for that, the Minister of the Environment is leading the creation of the Natural Capital Committee, with the support of the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Economic. This committee, among others, will design the implementation of the national system of environmental accounts based on ecosystem assets, the stocks, aligned with the system of environmental economic accounting published by United Nations. The Natural Capital Committee will be permanently advised by the Chilean Central Bank and the National Council for Science, Technology, Knowledge and Innovation. The mission of this Natural Capital Committee will be to advise and propose actions to the President of Chile in matters related to the measurement, the evaluation, and the valorization of and protection and restoration of the natural capital in Chile. Which allow us the integration of nature and biodiversity into the process and design and implementation of policies and sustainable development. This is just starting. We are working on that. The committee has decided to prepare a roadmap for the measurement. And how this is going to work, defining mandates and objectives. And this, we think, could have a great impact in all the ministries, because sometimes we're thinking the same, but we're not talking. And when you start talking, you discover that you're basically talking the same. If we think, for example, the word ecology actually talks about the ecos, which is the house. The house is the same house. Is the house that is the soil, is the economics, is everything, no? This will have to do with decisions with environmental policy, taxes, development policy, economic innovation, and research for sure. The idea is to take action, to go beyond this vision statement and to really do something. Well, basically to start to really mainstream nature and biodiversity into the way that we are developing. We'll start a pilot initiative to establish first a baseline capital at the country level, but probably focus it in some regions. The idea, we also have approved Escazú, which is an agreement to provide protection and environmental information for everyone and protection for environmental defenders. So that's also a principle that we want to merge with the creation, the leveraging of this information. Well, we will seek to have information for soil, vegetation, and different processes. The World Bank report on mobilizing finance for nature identifies the lack of data and accessibility issues as one of the core barriers holding finance for nature. The pilot initiative of Natural Capital Baseline and Natural Capital Committees aims also to promote efforts to use public resource data on natural resource and can be used by a private actor and for the public in general. Aligned with that, we already is working the Fondo Naturaleza Chile, which is a fund, a non-profit organization with public and private sector to mobilize resources for conservation from all sources. For now, it have mostly the fund from the government, but the idea is to collect money from all sources to actually support and implement measures for conservation of biodiversity. This fund is taking the experience of other countries. And the environmental funds, I won't mention the many examples, but the idea basically is to have an institution that can actually channel action for biodiversity complemented with other public sources and coordinate with other state officials to reduce the gap in terms of financing. And that is something that didn't take mostly the will to do it. The fund also seeks to strengthen the local civil society. We cannot think conservation without asking the people that lives there what exactly they want to do and how they want to develop. So it has a strong territorial focus and promote conservation in their own territories in a very participative way. We are placing special effort and emphasis on working with communities living close to protected areas because they have a key role into that. And finally, the ultimate goal is to drive changes in policy and investment and mainstreaming in other ministries, not only finance, but everyone. Like, this is really important. I think the people is hearing now. People is more open than say 5 years ago, but most of the people don't know exactly what to do. So sometimes they come to our minister say like, okay, I want to be more green. What exactly I have to do if I'm I don't know, I do roads. What do I have to do if I am taking care of health of people? So all of that, are places that really takes or will to move forward and to push and to mainstream these ideas into all different sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. And I think it's a great example of putting together ministries of finance, planning, central banks, and environment. Because at the end, having good taxonomies is the first step, Sylvia, as you mentioned, to then have more financing mechanisms, to have green bonds, to have sustainability-linked bonds. The IDB supported a great experience in Uruguay. We had the first sustainability-linked bond linked to the NDC of Uruguay. It was the first one with step up and down. And for this first time had a KPI related with biodiversity, with forest. But the Ministry of Finance of Uruguay was saying at the COP in Egypt, I would like to follow in the future also with biodiversity. And the IDB is developing a platform for the ministers of finance of the region for climate and sustainability. We're just starting. We are going to have about $30 million from IKI, from the government of Germany, to support and strengthening the capacities at the ministries of finance to continue the agenda of climate and then bring also the agenda of biodiversity and the link among them. But thinking about financing, we've had an amazing experience internally at the bank, putting together our team of climate, biodiversity, and nature with the team of the bank that developed the financing instruments, capital markets and financing instruments. And I think that cultural approach of learning each other is also what we want to foster at the country level. And that's why I would like to give the word to Slav, because we have started as IDB to work with debt swaps. The Nature Conservancy has been a great partner. I think the example of Barbados was a great example to free about $50 million for different issues of sustainability that Slav will share. But also from the private side of the IDB, we have started to provide blue bonds. IDB Invest, our private sector arm, launched their first blue bond last year, the COP26. And this week, they finalized the first blue bond with a bank in the region, with Banco Bolivariano in Ecuador. It was 60 million from IDB Invest and FinDev Canada. And one of the KPIs is the disclosure of that private sector bank of TMFD. It's the first bank in the region that is going to have the disclosure about TNFD. So I think it's also the way to show how our private sector is not only directly financing, but supporting banks in the region and private sector companies to advancing the agenda. So Slav, going back to debt for swaps, we were commenting the blog from the IMF. I shared with you a panel led by TNC, also with IMF, the first time that the IMF was in a Global Biodiversity. So please share with us how was the experience with Barbados, lessons learned, and when can we do that in the future with you and MDBs in general?
Well, it's always a sign of good experience when you do more of it, right? Stay at a wonderful hotel or resort, go to a restaurant, and then want to do it again and again and again, and more of it. And so that's how we feel about our partnership with IDB. We were really very, very pleased to have forged that in Barbados, and was very impactful there. So it wasn't a massively large transaction in terms of dollar volume. It was $150 million, which for Barbados is important. But also, when you look at the efficiency of the transaction in unlocking $50 million in conservation savings, or rather financial savings, that then the visionary government of Mia Mottley, after all, the same government who came up with the Bridgetown initiative, basically showing what leadership is about, not just talking about it, not just advocating for it, but actually practicing it on home soil, or I should say in home waters, because Barbados may be a small island developing state, but it's actually a large ocean economy. It sits on just under 200,000 square kilometers of exclusive economic zone. And so what did the government want ultimately? The government wanted to protect in a meaningful way and to create a blue economy, a sustainable blue economy in Barbados. And while they had much less than 1% of protection on the eve of the transaction, which closed in September, by the way, so we're still kind of living a bit in the afterglow of the transaction as developing the new pipeline. It had ambitious targets towards, guess what, protecting how much of their ocean? How much? What is the magic number? 30 is the magic number. For 30 by 30, right, guys? So protecting 30% of their ocean by 2030. But they needed to do it in a credible way. What the TNC we don't want to see, and what our partner governments don't want to see, is the creation of paper parks. So protection in name only. And to be able, to your point, madam, to be able to do so, you need funding. I totally agree with your point that the type of funding that is needed for biodiversity and conservation is of different flavor, perhaps from traditional gray infrastructure, which tends to be capital intensive and upfront. But funding is still needed. There is a very influential TNC Paulson report that estimated that the nature funding gap is $700 billion per year. Admittedly, so that's a chunk of change. Admittedly, 500 of that or so is negative flows, subsidies that must be reduced. That still leaves a healthy 200 billion or so per year that is needed for this, that, and the other thing. But the type of funding that tends to be needed is basically of an annuity type of payment, regular payments per year over the long haul that would basically contribute to stretch national budgets. Because when you think of small island developing states, when you think about emerging markets, they have been buffeted by climate change, by COVID, etc. And so, speaking of finance ministers, when you look at the waterfall of payments that the finance minister must worry about, spending on protecting biodiversity tends to be pushed down. And so, therefore, why are these debt for nature swaps, or debt, as we call them, debt conversions, so powerful? Because with one instrument, they address the triple crisis that we're facing today: debt, biodiversity, and climate. Why? Because they reduce pre-existing indebtedness, or you stay debt neutral, but then you create, the alchemy of those transactions is that you create this reliable long-term flow of conservation funding that can then be deployed to make area-based protections and other biodiversity commitments more credible. So in short, we love this theme. We think that it's very powerful. We think that it can be replicated elsewhere in IDB's footprint, because many of your member states, borrowing member states, are right now being shut out from the traditional capital markets. Even Colombia, recently floated a new plain vanilla Eurobond at 8% yield. That is high. And then, let alone, the small island developing states, let alone others like Ecuador, etc., who are now facing double-digit yields. So practically, they don't have access to capital markets, and therefore, when you do a debt conversion, you give them access through MDB risk mitigation, to your point of the role of MDBs. So, deploying a little bit of MDB, capacity as a sweetener, as a first loss facility that then brings up the credit rating of these issuances. So in Barbados, it went up from single B, right? That's the sovereign credit rating of Barbados. So we went from a single B issuer to a transaction that was rated AAA/AA through partial guarantees from IDB and TNC. And that allowed Barbados, right, to then repurchase a portion of its Eurobond and to generate the types of savings. So I think that more can be done, more should be done, and I can keep going about it because I'm very passionate and happy about this topic, but I will yield the floor to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Slav. And I think it's important to share with the audience that the IDB has developed this new instrument, is policy-based guarantees. That, as Slav was mentioning, is a guarantee that we provide after also the country complies with some conditions that we support with technical cooperation in advance. But something that everybody's asking is the role of the rating agencies, and you mentioned that stuff. And it's important to share this. I was in a panel the other day with S&P and others, and I said, listen, the way you account a guarantee for us, not only IDB, MDBs in general, is the same that you account a loan. So we need to start thinking about the financial system to maybe see guarantees in a different way if we, in general, want the MDBs to do more of this. The second issue is, as you said, the leadership of Barbados has been amazing. And I was explaining at the TNC panel that Barbados also has a contingency line of credit for natural disasters with IDB. It's an instrument that we have for the ministers of finance to respond to natural disasters. They are not part of our envelope, and the ministers of finance don't pay interest until they use it. And lately, the IDB developed the hurricane clause from our Treasury Department to be part of the operations and postpone the payments of principals in case of hurricanes, if the country has the contingency line. Large explanation to say that the policy-based guarantee that we provided for the deal in Barbados with TNC has also the hurricane clause because they already had the contingency line. So it's a very good example of how you put together different instruments to start not only freeing money, as Slav mentioned, for conservation, biodiversity, climate, but also to help the country build also more resiliency for the future. Well, now I would like to talk about financing innovations with entrepreneurs, with institutional investors. And before giving the word to Mariana, the role that our third part of the IDB group, IDB Lab, is playing, I think is very important. We are finalizing a new fund with BitLab that wants to reach about 60 million to support entrepreneurs related to climate and nature. And they have worked together with us in working with the intrinsic value exchange to create a new natural asset at the New York Stock Exchange. So you can have natural capital companies in the future, um, not only trading, but also listed at the New York Stock Exchange. So we hope we can continue supporting that process and supporting entrepreneurs like Mariana. Mariana is leading, I would say, the first habitat bank in the region for compensation of biodiversity. So welcome, Mariana. Congratulations. And I would like you to share your experience and what role can we continue doing with entrepreneurs like you. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Um, Again, my name is Mariana Sarmiento. I'm the CEO of Terrazos. And just a brief, some background on kind of how it all started, um, because we'll be connecting a lot of the dots. So, Terrazos is a Colombian company. Today, we have um, 2,500 hectares under management as habitat banks. And I'll go into a little bit about what that means. 5 years ago, when we started talking to IDB, there were two people in my company. Right now, there's 20, 20 people plus another 20 that are on the ground. And it's really the result, I think, of what we started with IDB, 5 years ago. And I have to say that the UK government has also been part of this through the Partnership for Forest program. But a few years ago, Colombia passed a regulation on, it fine-tuned the how compensation needed to be done by large development projects. And that regulation was wonderful. TNC was actually involved in it. Um, but it created an opportunity for a market because it established that development projects needed to compensate if their residual impacts within the same ecosystem and within the same watershed. So this created an opportunity in which you would be able to read and anticipate the demand for conservation and restoration of that critical habitat that would be impacted by a lot of these projects. So this is something that I started thinking about, and I had worked in the government before. They said, Mariana, take a look at this regulation. What do you think? You're going to have a supply issue. So the policy created certain elements that would allow you to create a market, but you needed to create that supply. So that's when, multiple people, I ended up connecting with Greg, with Greg at the time. But it was really about putting an idea together, a business opportunity that we saw because of what policy had done, and then being able to experiment that. And I think that talks about what institutions like the IDB can do. Not only can they shape policy so that we are reducing harm, but also promote innovation and experimentation that can create business opportunities that protect and restore nature. And within that process, it was very important, and it always has been, that three issues were addressed through that funding. And that funding consisted of a $150,000 grant and then a commitment to get to $1 million in equity if we were able to prove like certain things of the market and of the business model. But what was really powerful, and multilaterals understand that, not everybody does, was that they needed to invest in the business model development in the organization. So Terrazos needed to be strengthened in order to be able to actually deploy this successfully. but also invest in the enabling conditions. And in this case, the enabling conditions required engagement with the government. And then the result of that is that in 2017, there was a habitat banking regulation passed in Colombia that set the rules, not just so that terrazos would do habitat banks, but that anybody in the country can set up a habitat bank. And the way that a habitat bank works, it's an actual place, right? So it's, our projects are between 300 to 600 hectares, critical habitat that is being protected for at least 30 years. So each habitat bank creates units of biodiversity, or biodiversity credits, which seems to be a very popular term going around. And it can only be sold once, right? So it's a very transparent way, but also a very efficient way of doing compensation from multiple companies that are creating impacts. And then the result of all that process, we began to get a lot of interest from landowners. Hey, can this be a habitat bank? Well, there was no offset demand. There weren't any impacts in that watershed. And because of this type of funding, and that's when Partnership for Forest also came in, we were like, oh, let's see if we can package this product in a different way so that we can find voluntary buyers for this credits. And so we created the first methodology for voluntary biodiversity credits. And we're, kind of shaping a little bit these conversations and moving that forward. But it's the importance of having pilot projects that can demonstrate how these opportunities actually take place on the ground. And because if we don't do that, then like, where do we start? It's a chicken and egg situation, and that requires taking risk. And also making sure that you're doing it with the right partners. And in that sense, having IDB next to us has been instrumental. The traction that we get from the largest companies in Colombia to do their offsets through our habitat banks, which didn't exist before. A lot of it has to do because they know that there's really strong institutions backing these kinds of innovations. So, so that's in a nutshell. And I just like to mention one more thing, which you said, that we need to strengthen the capacity of finance ministers. But I think it's also really important to strengthen the capacity of the ministries of environment to be able to engage these conversations about business. We struggle all the time because the ministries of environment, we're like, no, you need the market conditions. Oh wait, markets, they're the devil. Like, no, like, there's a huge opportunity here. And we really need people, officials within the ministries of environment, to be able to understand and have conversations with the ministries of finance. Because if not, then the power, then the power relationships are going to be really complicated, and we've suffered that. So thank you.
Great point, Mariana. I think that's the challenge. And I put the example internally at the bank because it has been a fascinating process of us from the Department of Sustainability learning from the financing mechanisms and vice versa. So I think that's what, as I mentioned, what we need to also support our countries. And the next step with IDB Lab, not only to support financially entrepreneurs, innovators like you, is the use of technology. So they have just started an innovative program and a challenge for tokenization of biodiversity. And as part of the Amazon initiative of the bank, for example, with OPIAG in Colombia, we're starting a process for tokenization of indigenous territories to then bring the variable of biodiversity. So I think in addition to the role of technology and innovation, not only tokenization, but blockchain is going to be key to ensure also and ensure that the resources will get to the communities. Thank you. Dominic, I wanted to start by saying that the Dasgupta report was a very important report in 2021, in February. Um, it was an honor for me and the IDB to be part of that process. And it was led by the UK Treasury, again, sending a very good signal of the importance of biodiversity from the economic point of view, the intrinsic value of biodiversity as part of GDPs. So thank you for that. I think it's becoming, as the Stern report was paramount for climate, we have now the Dasgupta report becoming a very important input for discussions related to biodiversity. But we would like to listen from you, your point from the UK government, also about the role of us, all the NDBs in the coming years, to support our countries in the implementation of the GBF. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Juan Pablo. And if I just add a rider onto the conversation we just heard, you're absolutely right, Mariana. We need to have development, environmental and finance ministries talking with each other. And that's why the UK came here with 4 ministers, including a minister from our finance ministry. And I think one of the great innovations of this particular CBD COP is having a finance day and getting the environment folk in there with the finance folks so they can communicate and cross-fertilize. And that was part of the thinking with the Dasgupta review, and in particular asking the UK Treasury Finance Ministry to be responsible for it, not having it in a kind of silo marked environment, because what that did was it enabled the Dasgupta review to speak to central banks, to speak to business, and to speak to the multilateral development banks, and that I think is critical. So the way that we approach as the UK the whole conversation about gripping the biodiversity crisis, we look at it at a strategic level as well as at a really local level. And one of the great things we've picked up in this conversation so far is you need to be doing both. At a strategic level, as we looked a few years out before COP26 of the UNFCCC in Glasgow, we were thinking, how do you raise the discussion around nature to have a similar kind of engagement to the conversation globally on biodiversity, on climate change? And on climate change, we've seen now that the private sector has really piled in there. Consumers are piled in there. People understand it. And so one of the things that we decided at Glasgow at COP26 was that we would really focus on how you bring, in a way that is relevant to the UNFCCC, how you would bring nature into the heart of that conversation. So the Dasgupta review, the biodiversity review there, and the economics of biodiversity was one aspect of that. But so was the real emphasis on nature-based solutions to climate change, recognizing that you cannot think about climate change in a bucket marked climate change and have a separate conversation somewhere else about biodiversity. These two things are intimately linked. And there's a great index on global biodiversity, the Living Planet Index, that shows since 1970 an appalling figure, a reduction in global wildlife populations around the world, population abundance of 68%. And that's a good proxy for the impact since 1970 across the planet on biodiversity, a reduction of 68%. And the 3 main causes of that are human-caused land use change, human-caused climate change, and the exploitation of wildlife. And so you can just see the linkage there between the climate change convention and the whole biodiversity debate. And that was why, Juan Pablo, we were so enthusiastic to work with you as an MDB community in Glasgow under COP26 to get that statement out, that joint statement. And just before I talk about that, I'll just mention that also as part of our climate change commitment, the UK announced 3 billion of that climate change money would also be invested in nature-based solutions. So 3 billion pounds sterling of international climate finance on protecting nature and biodiversity. But we recognize that there is no way that international overseas development administration aid money is going to be enough. And we've talked a little bit about leveraging the private sector, some incredible ways that TNC has done that, Slav. But it needs to be more than that. And so we've been supporting the initiative taken by the Maldives, by Ecuador, and by Gabon together that was announced at UN General Assembly in September this year for a 10-point plan on financing biodiversity. And Slav, you talked about, the 700 billion gap is it's a fair chunk of change, I think is how you described it. Well, we're not going to get that chunk of change from government aid budgets. And so that 10-point plan is a political statement about how you actually bridge that gap. And it's the catalytic impact of aid, that's really important. It's private sector engagement. Mariana, plus, everything you're doing, but at real scale. It's philanthropy, and it's MDBs. It's the role of the multilateral development banks is absolutely critical within that 10-point plan, that vision for how we bridge the financing gap. And so the statement that you made as multilateral development banks in Glasgow, I think was kind of transformational for demonstrating that you as an MDB community were really hearing the importance for us as shareholders, but also recipient countries of the prioritization and the mainstreaming of biodiversity. And enormous credit to you as the IDB for your leadership with other MDB colleagues. And you talked about in that statement providing international leadership on nature and mainstreaming it, which is something that if you as the MDBs do, that helps us as national banks, as national administrations. And still we talked about the challenge within any government, it's true of the UK government as well, of mainstreaming biodiversity. You committed to tackling the drivers of nature loss by making nature positive investments. And all of us are working on what on earth nature positive means. Now, so we talked about doing no harm, and that's great, but that was yesterday's thing. Nature positive is about investments and activities that actually contribute to generating biodiversity in a way that we haven't done in the past. And then fostering national and regional level synergies and local as well, and the critical role for Indigenous peoples and local community with enhanced public reporting. So that statement was a real line in the sand. And over the year or so since the statement was made in Glasgow, it's been terrific to see the progress that you as an MDB community have made. And we heard some of that earlier this week. You've created an MDB Nature and Biodiversity Working Group to share best practice, to speed innovation. You developed joint guidance for tracking and reporting nature positive investments. And we heard a public commitment by the Vice President of the IDB on behalf of all the MDBs to support countries to implement the Global Biodiversity Framework. And that is so welcome, because coming out of COP15, we want there to be an ambitious global biodiversity framework, and that has to involve the mobilization of resources to enable countries to develop that. And that's got to be that blended finance, that mix of finance. So we as the UK, we as the G7, we've called on the MDBs to align your operations with the Global Biodiversity Framework, once agreed to support net zero, climate resilient and nature positive development pathways, and to scale up and increase your nature positive investments, including through nature mainstreaming, which you talked about so eloquently there, Juan Pablo, and delivering climate finance with nature co-benefits. So this is hitting more than one target with the same dollar. And that is absolutely critical part of nature mainstreaming. And to announce initiatives, specific initiatives. And you gave a great example of your partnership with TNC there. I love the initiatives that you were talking about, Mariana, and you, Daniela. The Blue Carbon Fund is one of those initiatives. And it's a way of leveraging private sector innovation, of embedding blue carbon markets across your region by helping to develop sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, coastal zone management and ecotourism. So there are many things that we're trying to do together. There is no one recipe, but it's really clear that mainstreaming nature it's a kind of a different way of thinking, and it's a way of thinking that we managed to achieve since Paris on climate change. And what we're looking to do with the support of the MDBs and with other partners here in Montreal is to move forward with a global biodiversity framework that achieves that same kind of mainstreaming of nature and biodiversity across everything that we are doing, essentially to create a Paris moment for nature here in Montreal. And I'm only sorry that my French colleague can't hear me saying that I want a Paris moment for nature here in Montreal, as well as a Glasgow one. You're too kind, Juan Pablo. Thank you.
No, thank you, Dominic. And you mentioned something that is very important. Is the role of all of us together. So the recognition is not for IDB, it's for all the NDB colleagues that are here with us today. And I would like to recognize the work that Greg Watson, who coordinates the Natural Capital and Biodiversity Group at the IDB, has done with all our colleagues that are here from the NDB. So thank you all. The second issue that you mentioned is the indigenous groups. I had forgotten to mention the importance. We cannot talk about biodiversity, natural capital, or mainstreaming without talking about that, in particular Latin America and the Caribbean. And we've learned a lot. This is a learning process, as you mentioned, in the last year and a half, as part of the Amazon initiative of the bank. We are developing a bioeconomy program with COICA for all the different indigenous communities of the Amazon. And I want to share this experience with you. When we started talking with them, we said, listen, we're going to present a proposal for the Green Climate Fund about bioeconomy. And we really wanted to talk with you to understand better how you can be beneficiaries of the fund. And they said, no, we don't want to be beneficiaries. We want to co-create that with you. So we learned a new word that I'm using every day more in a very humble way. It's co-creation with indigenous communities about bioeconomy. So beyond that, we're strengthening COICA for the project preparation of programs, and we hope to advance with the bioeconomy program with them in the Amazon. You mentioned a key word, which is partnerships. We've heard here people from different governments, developed countries, private sector, NGOs, and having in mind that important word, I would like to pass the word to Federico Azañez, the manager of outreach and partnership of the IDB, to close the event. Thank you, Federico.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Again, my name is Federico Bazañez, and I'm in charge of the Office of Outreach and Partnership. And as you can see from the conversation with all our partners are very important to us, and we're convinced that we can't be impactful in the region without you. So we really appreciate not only the conversation, but everything that you do for our region. Juan Pablo asked me to close this event, and it's going to be difficult because I think we could sit down here and discuss these issues for much longer. It's very interesting to see everything that we're all doing from different perspectives to mainstream biodiversity issues. But first, I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank Sylvie, and on her behalf, I want to thank France for everything that they do for the region and for the bank and for their leadership. She reminded us of the importance of assessing and measuring to help raise understanding to the ministers of finance, and also continue the dialogue with the environmental ministers as well, to help mainstream and to bring the private sector. I wanted to thank Daniela for sharing the extremely interesting experience of Chile and how they are mainstreaming biodiversity. I wanted to thank Slav for very passionately sharing with us this extremely important innovation of that swap in Barbados, and hopefully with TNC we can continue doing many more of those. I wanted to thank Mariana for her leadership and innovation and working with us to making Habitat Banks a reality. I want to thank Dominique also for on his behalf to the UK for their leadership with the region and with the bank. Also reminding us the importance of working with the finance folks and environmental folks and having a good conversation there, to work it on a strategic level, but also at a local level, and to link climate and biodiversity are all very important aspects of this conversation. I also wanted to thank the more than 40 people who are sitting around the table, who've, unfortunately, we didn't have time to interact with you, but I'm sure we will have it later on. And the more than 200 people that are connected online. We wish we could have a more detailed conversation with you. And by the way, you're missing a beautiful snowy day here in Montreal. We'll probably post pictures so you can enjoy a little bit of that too. I also wanted to thank Juan Pablo and Greg and Isabel and all the group at the bank that works very hard on these issues and takes a lot of pride and a lot of effort coordinated with everybody. And, one of the things that struck me the most during this conversation is the amount of collaboration that we're all involved in. And I think, as they say in the US, it takes a village. And I think it's going to take all of us from different angles and with different, using each other's strengths to achieve what needs to be achieved. The challenge is enormous. And I'm not a biodiversity specialist, but the statistics for Latin America are simply compelling. Our region comprises 57% of the world's remaining primary forest, including 1/4 of the world's mangroves. It stores approximately 104 gigatons of carbon, with the Amazon region holding about 10% of the carbon in the world. Sadly, current trends suggest that the biodiversity in Latin America and the Caribbean is endangered. In other words, the region is a biodiversity powerhouse under threat. However, with all the things that we're doing and all the things that we heard today, I do believe that we can move the needle and make some real progress. Each stakeholder has a role to play, and all the examples that we have discussed show that when well-articulated collaboration it's performed, it can be transformative. We need donor countries to provide further resources to build the enabling environment and also provide blended finance and de-risking instruments to finance nature-based solutions. We need MDBs to play their catalytic role by providing technical assistance, adequate financing to all players, from startups to governments. We need expert organizations such as the Nature Conservancy to continue partnering with us. And we need governments to integrate natural capital into their policy design and the private sector to internalize the economic value of natural capital. The IDB started early work on the topic with the creation of our Natural Capital Lab in 2019. Our Natural Capital and Biodiversity Mainstreaming Action Plan is underway, and we're currently working with other MDBs, as many of you mentioned, on preparing a nature-positive finance definition, taxonomy, and tracking. I think we all agree the importance of doing that. We are already using concessional funding to support many countries in the mainstreaming and placing of value on natural capital. Lastly, we're finding innovative ways to use our financial instruments to finance nature-based projects or targets. We're confident that these efforts make us the option of choice in the region, along with our robust ecosystem of partners like you. This is only the beginning of the conversation. I look forward to continuing it. We must replicate the success of the Debt for Nature transactions with more donors coming in as co-guarantors. And by the way, we have conversations with many other donors that are really excited and to follow the example with TNC. Also, we must keep pushing for more government to integrate nature-based concepts into their policy and making, like Chile and other countries in the region. So I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation in the future. Thank you very much.
Still be on record.
We would like to take a picture of all of you. Could we?
I just know that we're. I just know that we're all very scared in Argentina. So.